So now that we know what Redux is, basically an alternative to React Context, and now that we also know why we might want to use it over React Context in some apps, the big question that remains is, how does Redux work? Well, Redux is all about having one central data store in your application. And with data, I mean state. And that is super important. You have exactly one store. You never have more than one store. It's one store for all your state for your entire application. So in this store, you would store authentication state, theming, maybe some user input state you want to save, whatever it is. Whichever cross-component or app-wide state you have, it goes into this one store. Now, this might sound unmaintainable, but the good thing is that we don't directly need to manage the entire store all the time, as you will see throughout this module and the next modules. So we have this central data store. What do we do with it? Ultimately, we have data in that store so that we can use it from inside our components. Because if some data there changes, if the authentication status of a user changes, for example, we want to know about that in a component so that we can react accordingly and update the UI. For this, components set up subscriptions to our central store. They subscribe to the store, and whenever the data changes, the store notifies components, and then components can get the data they need, for example, the current authentication status, so they get a slice of the Redux store, and they can then use it. And of course, we're going to see all of that in action, in detail, in this course. So that's how we get data out of the store. But of course, since this is state, so data which also changes from time to time, we need a way of changing that data. So how do we change data in the store then? Here's one very important rule. Components never directly manipulate the store data. So we have that subscription, but we don't have a data flow in the other direction, at least not a direct data flow. Components don't directly manipulate that data in the store. Instead, for that, we use a concept called reducers. We have a reducer function. This reducer function, which we have to set up, this function is responsible for mutating, so for changing the store data. Now, one important note here, the term reducer is of course something we have heard before with useReducer, and the reducer function here is not that useReducer hook we learned about. Reducer functions in general are just a general concept. Reducer functions are functions which take some input and then transform that input. They reduce it. For example, they can reduce a list of numbers to the sum of that number. And that's just one example. But they, in general, transform inputs and spit out a new output, a new result. So that's a general programming concept which useReducer, this hook, uses, and which this reducer function, Redux, will use, also uses. Okay, so we have a reducer function which is responsible for updating the store data, and we have components that subscribe to that data. How do we now connect components and that reducer function? Because ultimately, it will of course be the components that should trigger a data change. It is, for example, a click on a button in a component that should trigger some data change. So how do we connect that? Trigger is a good word for that, because we have a third concept here. We have actions, and components dispatch actions. And therefore, we could also say that components trigger certain actions. Now, an action is really just a simple JavaScript object which describes the kind of operation the reducer should perform. Therefore, Redux then forwards actions to the reducer, reads that description of the desired operation, if you want to call it like this, and then this operation is performed by the reducer. So components dispatch actions which describe what should be done, but don't do it directly. Then these actions are forwarded to the reducer. The reducer then does what the action wants the reducer to do. And then the reducer spits out a new state which effectively will replace the existing state in that central data store. And when that happens, when that state in that data store is updated, subscribing components are notified so that they can update their UI. That's how Redux works. Now, of course, that's all nice, that's great theory, but how does that look like in reality then? How does the code we have to write look like? Well, that's what we're going to explore now.